History as it happens, October 26, 2023. Bidenomics.
Bidenomics is working. When I took office, the pandemic was raging, and our economy was reeling. Supply chains were broken, millions of people unemployed, hundreds of thousands of small businesses on the verge of closing after so many had already closed. Literally hundreds of thousands on the verge of closing. Today, the U.S. has the highest economic growth rate, leading the world economies since the pandemic, the highest in the world.
From day one of his presidency, Joe Biden has vowed to do something about income inequality in America. And heading into an election year, the president will point to his legislative record on infrastructure, inflation, job creation, you name it. So what is Bidenomics, and does it really work? Can any president, past or present, take credit for good times? That's next with Robert Gordon as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
A most serious domestic problem. That problem is inflation.
Yes, you can lick inflation by increasing productivity and by decreasing the cost of government to the place that we have balanced budgets and are no longer grinding out printing press money.
What I'm saying is that we've got to be straightforward. We have to make sure we understand that to return dignity to the middle class, they have to have insurance that is covered and they can afford it. They have to make sure that we are in a situation where there's continuing education and they're able to pay for it.
We're going to talk about the obscenity of the 50 wealthiest Americans now owning more wealth than the bottom half of our society.
Under the disaster known as Bidenomics, Hispanic Americans, African Americans, and young people are hurting like never before.
Some breaking economic data.
That's right. Inflation cooled to 4% in May on an annual basis.
President Joe Biden touted the August jobs report, which showed U.S. employers added 187,000 jobs.
Well, there are two ways to define Bidenomics, the way Biden would like and the way the average person does. And I think this gets at the puzzle of why Biden is so unpopular.
Remember the Occupy Wall Street protests? Here in Washington, they were called Occupy K Street. A tent city took over McPherson Square downtown. Well, I remember after those protests died down, talking about what they accomplished, if anything. Well, my conclusion then is still my view today. After the '08 crash and the bailouts of Wall Street, not Main Street, the protesters with their chant, their mantra, propelled the issue of income inequality back into the political mainstream. If we weren't fixing the problem, at least we were talking about it again. Those words, "we are the 99%, embodied the idea that American capitalism was broken. Why were some people so stinking wealthy while the working class struggled to afford housing, childcare, education, the basics of life, so the argument went. And no single politician did more than Bernie Sanders to get political parties to take income inequality seriously again.
We'll be asking about how it happens that the top 0.1% now owns more wealth than the bottom 90%. 0.1% more wealth than the bottom 90%. And two individuals, Bezos and Musk, now own more wealth than the bottom 40%. And meanwhile, we're looking at more hunger in America than at any time in decades.
Sanders lost the race for the Democratic nomination, but he won the argument. His focus on this issue influenced, in my view, the policies Joe Biden would propose as he ran for president in 2019, even before the pandemic struck. This is from a Democratic debate in June 2019.
Donald Trump has put us in a horrible situation. We do have enormous income inequality. And the one thing I agree on is we can make massive cuts in the $1.6 trillion in tax loopholes out there. And I would be going about eliminating Donald Trump's tax cuts for the wealthy.
And now as he runs for re-election, the president is touting Bidenomics. But Americans don't seem to be buying it. Here's a headline from Bloomberg News. Trump is winning over swing state voters wary of Biden's economic plan. Voters in 7 states trust Trump more on the economy, polls show. Now, I'm not exactly sure why this is, but it probably has something to do with inflation. Yes, inflation's come down, but prices are still elevated. You know, presidents love to take credit when the economy is going well. and then shift the blame when times are tough. And sometimes they do have a point. Factors outside the White House's control in our age of globalization impact American households. When Jimmy Carter was running for re-election in 1980, he tried to make this point in his only debate with Ronald Reagan just days before the election.
Again, it's important to put the situation into perspective. In 1974, we had a so-called oil shock, wherein the price of OPEC oil was raised to an extraordinary degree. We had an even worse oil shock in 1979. In 1974, we had the worst recession, the deepest and most penetrating recession since the Second World War. The recession that resulted this time was the briefest we've had since the Second World War. In addition, we've brought down inflation. Early this year, the first quarter, we did have a very severe inflation pressure brought about by the OPEC price increase. It averaged about 18% the first quarter of this year. The second quarter, we had dropped it down to about 13%. The most recent figures, the last 3 months of the third quarter of this year, the inflation rate is 7%. Still too high, but it illustrates very vividly that in addition to providing an enormous number of jobs, 9 million new jobs in the last 3.5 years, that the inflationary threat is still urgent on us.
Governor Reagan, during the past 4 years, the consumer price index has risen from 4.8% to currently over 12%. And perhaps more significantly, the nation's broader underlying rate of inflation has gone up from 7 to 9%. Now, a part of that has been due to external factors beyond U.S. control, and notably the more than doubling of OPEC oil prices last year, which leads me to ask you whether, since the United States remains vulnerable to such external shocks, can inflation in fact be controlled? If so, specifically what measures would you pursue?
Mr. Ellis, I think this idea that has been spawned here in our country that inflation somehow came upon us like a plague and therefore it's uncontrollable and no one can do anything about it is entirely spurious, and it's dangerous to say this to the people. When Mr. Carter became president, inflation was 4.8%, as you said. It had been cut in two by President Gerald Ford. It is now running at 12.7%. President Carter also has spoken of the new jobs created. Well, we always, with the normal growth in our country and increase in population, increase the number of jobs. But that can't hide the fact that there are 8 million men and women out of work in America today, and 2 million of those lost their jobs in just the last few months. Mr. Carter had also promised that he would not use unemployment as a tool to fight against inflation. And yet his 1980 economic message stated that we would reduce productivity and gross national product and increase unemployment in order to get a handle on inflation, because in January, at the beginning of the year, it was more than 18%. Since then, he has blamed to the people for inflation OPEC. He's blamed the Federal Reserve System. He has blamed the lack of productivity of the American people. He has then accused the people of living too well, and that we must share in scarcity, we must sacrifice and get used to doing with less. We don't have inflation because the people are living too well. We have inflation because the government is living too well.
Reagan won the election, but soon he must have felt a bit like Carter, because a terrible recession hit the U.S. economy in 1981 to late 1982. It wasn't Reagan's fault. The Fed raised interest rates to curb, yes, inflation, and the severe tightening of monetary policy sent unemployment up to 11% by late 1982. By the time Election Day rolled around in 1984, however, Reagan was able to run heartwarming TV ads about how his policies had turned things around.
It's morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history. With interest rates at about half the record highs of 1980, nearly 2,000 families today will buy new homes, more than at any time in the past.
Reaganomics or Volckernomics or something else. President Biden's campaign will certainly produce TV ads accentuating the positive about the U.S. economy. Who knows, maybe even in the Reagan style.
It's morning again in America. Americans are happily visiting their grocery stores.
Mom, why do these eggs cost $9 a dozen?
Well, I'm not really sure. Maybe we should consult Bidenomics.
Oh God, this is terrible. No. That's not the message they're going for. This ad's gonna bomb. Hey folks, I never said my podcast was going to be humorous, but we do try once in a while. All right, we'll be serious again. This episode is about the long-running causes of income inequality, the structural changes in the U.S. and global economies that can't be easily undone or ameliorated by a single president or Congress. Problems that require new solutions, not a repeat of the old ones, if we can even consider those solutions at all anymore, like cutting taxes or throwing more money at social programs. Robert Gordon is an economist at Northwestern University. He focuses on unemployment, inflation, and the long-run and cyclical aspects of labor productivity. He is the author of The Rise and Fall of American Growth, which seeks to explain why economic growth has slowed down while income inequality has gotten worse since around 1975. The mid-'70s, when words like stagflation entered the lexicon. Robert Gordon, welcome.
Well, glad to be here.
Well, Robert, since the beginning of his presidency, Joe Biden's been talking about income inequality, helping the middle class. I suppose that's how he would define Bidenomics. How do you define Bidenomics?
Well, there are two ways to define Bidenomics, the way Biden would like and the way the average person does. And I think this gets at the puzzle of why Biden is so unpopular. The way Biden would like to define Bidenomics is the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a misnomer. It was primarily a climate change act providing massive subsidies for electric vehicles, for solar and wind, for expanding the electric grid, together with the CHIPS Act that provided $50 billion in subsidies for domestic and foreign firms to build new semiconductor chip factories in the United States. And then finally, the Infrastructure Act, which is going to provide all sorts of help for not just for highways and bridges, but also for mass transit.
With this help, we created 13.4 million new jobs. More jobs in 2 years than any president has ever made in 4 and 2. And folks, it's no accident. That's Bidenomics in action. Bidenomics is about building an economy from the middle out and the bottom up, not the top down.
So all of those different kinds of government spending are the essence of Bidenomics. What the average person sees, however, not making a distinction between inflation and the price level, is they see that the price level has gone up under Biden's administration compared to what they remember under Trump 4 years ago. And that is going to be a massive handicap for Biden going into the 2024 election. Now, some of this is a bit unfair. They link Biden with the inflation for two reasons. One is because they remember that under Biden, there were very generous government handouts to individual families and also to the unemployed, and tax credits for children and a number of other worthy endeavors. It's sometimes forgotten that there were 3 episodes of government stimulus. The first 2 were under Trump in March 2020 and December 2020. Biden's came in March 2021. So this whole massive government stimulus that added up to 25% of GDP was not just a Biden policy, but it was also engineered under Trump as well. And so it's unfair to label him for it. But there is a linkage in the public mind between excess government spending and the inflation that resulted. And even though the inflation has come down, I mentioned that the public doesn't distinguish between the rate of change of prices, which is inflation, and the level of prices, which is how much gasoline costs. Is it now $4.50 instead of $3? That's what they remember. Or the price of eggs briefly reaching $5 a dozen instead of being $1.50. Those are the kinds of things that the public remembers and blames Biden for.
Yeah, presidents like to take credit when everything is going well, but then it's like a quarterback on a football team. Too much credit when things are going well, too much blame when things are going badly. What's your general feeling about presidents calling the economy or naming the economy after them. I mean, there were no Carternomics. I think we know why. He could relate to some of the problems we're having with inflation today. But there was a Reaganomics.
Well, some presidents. Well, first of all, we have a long-standing phenomenon of the economy influencing elections that has been chronicled by my graduate school classmate, Ray Fair of Yale, for many, many years. And this is that the effect of the economy on the presidential elections depends on the rate of growth of the economy, GDP, in the 6 months before the election. So a lot depends on whether the economy is in a recession or is growing strongly in the period between March and November of 2024. We can pull out some famous examples of how this worked. The economy was growing like crazy in 1972, and Nixon swamped McGovern at the 1972 election. Even though we had a massive recession in 1982, as Paul Volcker boosted interest rates sky high to fight inflation, by the time we got to 1984, interest rates had come way down and the economy grew like crazy at 7% annual rates between early 1983 and the election of 1984. So Ronald Reagan won a landslide re-election. George Bush the elder was defeated by Bill Clinton because there was a recession in 1991 that spilled over into higher unemployment in 1992. So there are lots of examples of this. One of the main reasons Barack Obama was elected to the presidency in 2008 was that we had the great financial crisis that climaxed between September and November of 2008 and defeated John McCain. So a lot depends on something we can't predict yet. We have predictions all over the map as to whether the economy will be in a recession in the 6 months before November 2024.
Yeah. Well, as I said at the top, President Biden spoke a lot about doing something, ameliorating income inequality, especially racial income inequality at the start of his presidency. So in terms of policy, if we go back to the beginning of his administration, the American Rescue Plan, the president had the generous child tax credit in there. That supporters said made a big dent in poverty, at least child poverty. Do you see it that way?
What Biden did for poverty is very minor, and was primarily the tax credits and indeed the overall stimulus spending of giving everybody a check of $600 or $1,200 per couple. But these are just a drop in the bucket compared to the overall problem of income inequality. Let me distinguish two different aspects of inequality. There's growing incomes at the top, and there are the income of superstars like Taylor Swift and the sports and entertainment stars that get incredible salaries. Our Northwestern football coach is suing the university because they fired him and took away a package of something like $5 or $6 million a year. The average chief executive officer earns 300 times as much as the average worker, whereas 40 years ago it was only 30 times, not 300 times as much. And a third reason that we have inequality at the top is simply the enormous increase in the ratio of the stock market valuation to average incomes. The stock market is now worth about 200 times GDP, whereas 10 years ago it was worth 1 times GDP. So anybody who owns stock has just become enormously better off. That mainly affects inequality of wealth rather than inequality of income. Then at the bottom, you have the weakness of labor unions. We have the effect of immigration and pushing down wages of low-skilled workers. And we have, in general, a lack of power of workers compared to the heightened power of business, partly due to the endless mergers that have been sort of ignored by the government for most of the time in the last 30 or 40 years, and the growing importance of right-to-work states. Right-to-work states are those originally in the South, but now increasingly in the North, that prohibit unions from requiring union dues and have greatly weakened the appeal of unions and their ability to organize. We have the UAW strike going on now, with already well-paid workers trying to greatly increase their wages. And all this is going to do is raise the prices of the cars of the big three domestic automakers and push consumers to buy the cars of Tesla, Hyundai, Kia, BMW, Mercedes, and all the other foreign brands that are made in the non-union southern states.
Yeah.
So put it all together. We've got a set of factors making the top people better off and a set of somewhat different factors making the people at the bottom worse off.
The president has also spoken about reviving U.S. manufacturing. What is your verdict there?
It's a lot of subsidies to do things that are more efficiently done in other countries. We need to distinguish between two different aspects of free trade. We buy imports because the goods are either better or cheaper. Otherwise, we would be buying goods at home. The enormous amount of offshoring of purchases of imports from China and other places over the last 30 years has come about primarily because wages are lower in China still than they are in the United States, and business firms there are very efficient and can make products more cheaply. We're better off because our consumers can buy better and cheaper goods that are made abroad than the equivalent American manufacturer can make in the United States. Now, this has one big problem. While it makes the consumers better off, it creates unemployment for the workers in the factories that are closed in the United States. It also makes workers better off if they happen to work in industries that export, because the more money China gets from selling us things, the more it's going to buy from us. And we sell a lot of things, including wheat and soybeans and agricultural products, as well as products like Boeing airplanes to China. The farmers and the Boeing workers and the Boeing shareholders do better when we have free trade. So that's the longstanding argument for free trade, and the loophole in it is that domestic workers for factories that are closed lose their jobs and their livelihoods, and often their lives are enormously diminished. The solution to this is to have free trade together with generous government assistance, retraining, and moving help for those who are losing their jobs.
Yeah, that part has been lacking. We've gotten the free trade part down since the early 90s with NAFTA.
Yeah, of course.
And
yeah. We don't do much better a job than other countries. Part of this is due to the fact that we have such a much lower level of welfare spending than other countries. We don't have a universal healthcare system. We don't have parental leave. We don't have generous unemployment benefits that would help people who lose their jobs in that way. So part of the problem with free trade is the same problem that creates more poverty in the United States, creates shorter lifespans in the United States. It's a general difference between us and the countries of Western Europe and Japan.
Why has inflation come down then? I mean, the president wants to take credit for that. Is that more a fiscal policy thing, the Fed finally getting its act together?
No, it's become more and more clear that the rise of inflation in 2022 and its decline in a surprising way in 2023 all comes back to the same thing. And this was the enormous effect of the pandemic in shifting consumer spending from services like retail and restaurants and concerts and sport events. People wouldn't go out because of the pandemic. And so what they did instead was buy goods. They bought personal computers, they bought exercise bicycles, they bought new furniture, they bought new patio equipment. And most of those items were made abroad. So we had an enormous shortage of both the goods themselves, of shipping, of railroads, of trucking, and the prices went up. We had a shortage of computer chips that created a shortage of cars, leading to a big increase in the prices, not only of new cars, but also of used cars. And that, of course, is all included in the consumer price index as one of the components of inflation. So a great deal of the inflation we had in 21 and 2022 was due to shortages pushing up prices, not just of oil and food, but also of many other things, including the prices of things like new and used cars. Yeah. Now the shortages are over. People are back to concerts, they're back to sporting events, they're back to restaurants. So the pressure on the supply of goods is come down. There are too many inventories of many kinds of goods. We've reversed that. And so we now have prices actually falling. The prices of used cars have fallen tremendously in the last 12 months. This doesn't bring prices down to where they were, but it means that the rate of change of prices, the thing that the Fed cares about, the 2% versus the 5 or 6%, is almost in reach. Now, one of the things that makes Biden so unpopular, by the way, is the Fed itself and its policies of raising interest rates. When people want to go out and buy a new house, suddenly they're confronted with 7.5% interest rates, whereas the same mortgages had interest rates a year and a half ago of 3%. People who have to move because of new jobs, because of changes in their lifestyle of having children and needing bigger houses, are suddenly finding that to switch from their current house with its 3% mortgage, they can't carry that mortgage over to the new house. They've got to get a new mortgage attached to the new house that's 7.5%. It makes it almost impossible for them to afford buying houses. So they go and they have to rent, and then that pushes up the price of rents. So that's all a component of inflation that has not gone away and has added to the unpopularity of Biden. So the Fed's anti-inflation policies that you'd think would help Biden by bringing down inflation actually have made inflation worse in the housing sector and added to Biden's unpopularity.
Speaking of high interest rates, folks who are unhappy today would be really unhappy if they took a trip back to the late 70s, early 80s. You mentioned Volcker before, and finally when interest rates were sharply cut, that helped the economy take off. Ronald Reagan reelected in 1984. Reaganomics. Critics of Reaganomics would say, well, that idea, which some people call trickle-down economics, are responsible for some of the income inequality we're seeing today. Tax cuts for the wealthy, severe cuts in public services. What does Robert Gordon think of that?
Well, we've seen that repeatedly. We saw in the aftermath of Reaganomics a weakening of labor unions, the very factor that I pointed to in trying to explain why inequality had become worse. We had Trump's tax cuts in 2018, enormous tax cuts for large corporations and for the wealthy. Compared to Western Europe, as I said, we have deliberately adopted a set of policies that hurt the poor, hurt the middle class, and help the rich. We have a much lower rate of taxation of high incomes than most other countries. We do not have a national sales tax that in many countries pays for things like universal health care, parental leave, and the other things that I mentioned that go with the modern welfare state in most Western European countries and countries like Japan and Australia. That's not entirely the fault of Reaganomics or policies adopted under Reagan. We didn't have universal health care at any time in our history, and Reagan certainly didn't take it away. The thing that changed under Reagan had an additional slant to it that we haven't brought up, and that was the idea that corporations should care about nothing other than, quote, maximizing shareholder value. That is, whatever you do as a corporation, you should make decisions that make your shareholders' profits as big as possible, with no other objective in mind at all. That was sufficiently in play by the late 1990s to explain much of the increase in stock prices. It's hard to remember the S&P 500, which is now around 4,300. Guess what it was in 1982 when Volcker was trying to cure inflation? It was only 100. It's gone up by a factor of 45. It tripled in the late 1990s, partly as a result of this philosophy of maximizing shareholder value. That means you do everything you can to hold down wages, raise prices, cut wages, don't care about your customers or your employees. And that was a side effect of Reaganomics. We know that Reagan broke the air traffic controllers union by firing them all. That's one of his first acts when he came into power in 1981.
It is for this reason that I must tell those who fail to report for duty this morning they are in violation of the law, and if they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated.
His compatriot in Britain, Margaret Thatcher, also broke the British unions by standing up to them. And what we're seeing now in the UAW strike and the screen actors and writers strikes and the occasional strikes at Amazon and Starbucks is a little bit of a comeback for labor, a little bit of a reversal of what we've been seeing over the last 20 or 30 years with the weakness of labor's bargaining power.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that next. You segued right into my next question, because as I mentioned, I was encouraged, or I was happy to see a president and maybe a Congress want to do more about ameliorating poverty, doing something about income inequality, strengthening unions. But the key premise of your book, or the argument of your book, is that between 1870 and 1970, there were major one-time life-altering innovations, things that could not be repeated. For instance, electrification. And also the nature of the global economy was different than it is today. So therefore, post-1975, there are many structural reasons why growth has slowed down and we have worse income inequality today. Professor Gordon, I hope I'm not botching your thesis here. Maybe we can just take on the union slice of this. There's really no going back to the golden era of unions. All those unionized industries are not in this country anymore.
That's right. Unions were primarily in manufacturing, and the share of manufacturing in this country and many other countries has declined. It was a side effect of free trade. It's made us much better off. We have an economy that is primarily engaged in producing services rather than goods. Unions have made much smaller inroads in the service industries. Let me rephrase the reference to my book. What we had from 1870 to 1970 was a one-time only period of rapid productivity growth that was accompanied in the early post-war years by what is called the Great Compression. That is the movement toward greater income equality, the reverse of income inequality. That was in part due to not only the heyday of the unions from FDR's New Deal through the 50s and 60s up through the mid-70s, but also the fact that we did not have open borders. The United States made most of the products that were purchased here. Imports were only 5% of our gross national product as opposed to the current 17%. So we made most of what we bought with union labor. The result of all this was partly because of those great innovations that you mentioned, not just electricity, but the internal combustion engine, the invention of air travel, indoor toilets, sanitation, communications, radio, television, telephones. All those things came together and made people better off at a rate that's higher than has been true since. We had a brief revival of productivity growth in the late 90s when computers and search engines and web browsers entered the scene, and we had a replacement of typewriters and filing cabinets by electronics. But since 2005, our productivity, that is how much each worker can produce every hour, has slowed down. And just as much as the demise of labor unions, the slowdown in productivity growth has been responsible for the very slow rate of growth of real wages. That is how much workers can buy after they've paid the price of higher inflation. And this slow productivity growth was particularly adverse and significant in the decade of the teens. Between 2010 and 2020, productivity growth was slower than at any point in U.S. history. And this meant that there was only a small amount of wiggle room for real wages to go up, even if profits were stable. Profits were not stable, however, so we had an enormous revival of the stock market and increased inequality. That's a lot to put on your plate.
Oh, man. Well, that's why I have you here. Some of the other factors you mentioned in your book, increase in imports, you've mentioned a couple of these already, increase in immigration, poor educational outcomes at the bottom end of the economic spectrum, the effects of automation in destroying middle-income jobs, the decline of purchasing power of the minimum wage. So again, we have this post-1975 period where growth has slowed down and income inequality is getting worse. So does that mean that it's a hopeless case, that Bidenomics, it might try, but it's only nibbling at the margins here?
We need to broaden this out beyond Biden.
Sure.
To make a conversion of the United States into something that looks more like a Western European, Sweden or France or some of the other countries with their much smaller levels of poverty, their higher levels of life expectancy because they have universal health care. You need to have, let's be honest, a Democratic president together with a Congress that is much bigger majorities for the Democrats in the House or the Senate than anything we've seen. We did see the Democrats take over control of Congress in 2018 after Trump had already passed his tax reduction act that benefited the rich and the corporations. But, if you look back, Obama was virtually powerless because there was a great big financial crisis in 2008. Even though it elected him, it kept unemployment high and economic growth very weak for years. And that was enough to bring the Republicans into control of Congress in the 2010 election. Obama was punished for the financial crisis recession. And what the Republican Congress did was to clamp down on the growth of government spending and enact measures that worked against equality, worked toward more inequality, put so-called sequester limitations on the growth of the kinds of government spending that help the middle class and the poor. And so basically, I'm becoming political here, but you asked the question, and I think this is the answer. You need to have a more left-wing government to take care of these issues. Of course, we've got the paradox that people who have only high school or less educations are strongly, at least the white population with less than high school education, are very strongly attracted to Trump for cultural reasons and not aware of these issues of rich versus poor.
The other side would say, conservatives might argue, greater government intervention or spending would crowd out the private sector, that the way to ameliorate income inequality is to unleash. I don't necessarily agree with this position.
Well, this is called trickle-down economics. If you make the rich rich enough, they'll spend some of their money on goods made by the poor. Trickle-down economics includes the prediction that economic growth will accelerate if we make taxes low enough, because this will unleash great founts of unexploited inventions that somehow are not being invented now because tax rates are too high. Well, we had an experiment. We had Trump's reduction in corporation income taxes from 31 to 21% with massive reductions in tax rates on the very highest income people. And conservative economists were predicting back in 2018 that this would transition our economy from a 2% growth path that we had in the teens to a 3% or a 4 or 5% growth path that was predicted by Trump and his economic advisors. It didn't happen. In fact, productivity growth, looking over the last 5 years since the Trump tax cuts, if anything, has been slower than it was in the previous 8 or 9 years, and that was really slow enough already. So it's just not empirically proven or demonstrated that making the rich better off does anything for economic growth or trickles down to benefit the majority of the people.
It just sounds like that, I don't want to say golden age, but that quarter century that followed the end of World War II, which, you call it the Great Compression, right? With the rising.
That's not my phrase, yes, but it's become very popular.
Yes.
Compression of the top incomes taking up less of the total pie and the bottom incomes taking up more of the total pie was the Great Compression.
That period, it's just going to be hard to repeat something like that again for all the reasons that we've discussed here.
Well, when you think of the fact that we had virtually no imports, we had strong labor unions, and we had almost no immigration, those things taken together created the world that we're not going to see again. We've got a great big immigration problem, and we've got a labor shortage in this country. And we could only figure out how to reform our immigration system so that we gave extra preference to those kinds of workers who want to come to our country from all over the world, who have the skills that we need to fill the job vacancies that are everywhere, from agriculture to restaurants. So there's a lot that we can do, not just raising taxes on the rich and growing welfare benefits for the poor. We need to do things that are much more constructive, starting with preschool education. We need intensive tutoring for those who are in the marginalized groups, the people who do badly in school. There's an enormous vocabulary gap at kindergarten between those children who have college-educated parents compared to those who don't. There's a lot that we can do beyond just throwing government money at anything that would be highly targeted towards solving some of the nation's problems. In my book, I put very high emphasis on preschool education. And if we don't have the money to have public education for everyone at age 3 or 4, do it for the poor people. Do it for the people whose children need the help and who are prevented from advancing in our current system.
Robert Gordon of Northwestern University, it was an honor to have you. And his book, I highly recommend it, The Rise and Fall of American Growth, the U.S. Standard of Living Since the Civil War. Go to historyasithappens.com and sign up for my newsletter. Every Friday morning, you'll get an email from the Washington Times. My newsletter every Friday, new episodes every Tuesday and Thursday. This is a podcast from the Washington Times.